welcome to the Facebook studios live at the Raisina Dialogue 2020. We're here to discuss some abstract international values about the Atlantic system and the new Indo-Pacific system. Will the two ever meet? Joining us to talk about this, we have Raphaëlle from the Institute of Strategic Research in France, and Vikram Singh, who looks at defense and aerospace with the US-India partnership in the United States. Thank you both very much for being here. Raphaëlle, let me ask you first. The Atlantic system, is it really about Western values? And what are these values? What is the system? Because we hear a lot about the Indo-Pacific, but India says it has its own Indian way, which is market economies, plural democracies, and a free political system. So what is the difference between the two systems? And is there a way to meet them?
Thank you very much. So that idea of an Atlantic order, you can see that very much as the idea of a Western, it represents the idea of a liberal, democratic, multilateral order, which is very much a post-Cold War product. And so I think the question is not really the difference between these Indian values today and the Atlantic order, but rather, can India become part of that order? And one issue is that I think that order today is shaky in the Western world itself. So if you see the tensions between the Europeans and the Americans today, the tensions within NATO. And the other thing is that, so that order represented the idea of a Western-centered world in which the assumption was that there was a primacy of Europeans and Americans shaping that order.
Right.
And as my work shows, that was not true. Actually, non-Western actors were actively shaping, norms way before the idea of rising powers, which is a quite recent idea with India and China in the 2000s. And what you see today is that actually, countries like India and China try to shape that order, and that the game is changing.
Right.
So it's not a question of joining that liberal order, but rather to try to find a new common ground where these different new actors, India and China, taking an important place.
So that's a very interesting point that you've raised, and Vikramjit, let me bring you in on this, because the Atlantic system is premised on countries that have shared values, as Raphaëlle just said. In the Indo-Pacific, there's two follow-up questions here. In the Indo-Pacific, I think one question is, do you see countries in this part of the world with shared systems, whether they're political systems, social systems, cultural systems, economic systems, whatever they may be? Can we find a common ground with other countries? And the second, and I think this is sort of corollary to the first as well, is that the Indo-Pacific is seen, the notion of the Indo-Pacific is seen again as a Western construct by some, in order to eliminate China from this language. So where does China fit into the Indo-Pacific system?
So I think that's two interesting follow-up questions. I think, look, at the end of the day, India is a bridge between these two systems. There's no doubt that the Indian values, democracy, pluralism, liberal market economy, are very congruent with the Atlantic values that really were the underpinning of why, a NATO could work and perhaps why a CETO could not work back in the 1970s. There wasn't really the enough common ground across Asia to build that same kind of alliance structure, which many in the United States thought would be part of the post-World War II order, and it didn't come to pass. And so the challenge is, and India embodies it, India is not interested in joining an Atlantic order. India is interested in having constructive relations across what are two fairly different orders. And even though the Atlantic order is shaky, it's still probably the most important organized alliance structure that the world has right now. And in the Indo-Pacific, you have countries that are just of such diversity that you're going to find them finding frameworks for cooperation that are not really based on a set of common values. And you don't have even the rhetorical ability to talk about that. So even if you have ASEAN, for example, as one of the core organizing structures for geopolitics in this region, is comprised of countries that are deeply different, from highly democratic to highly autocratic, from extremely poor to extremely wealthy, and yet they manage to work together. So there's an Indo-Pacific order, but it looks different, and it really balances different interests in a way that's fundamentally at odds in some ways from what the Atlantic order has tried to do.
And Raphaëlle, maybe you can come in on the China question as well, because from where you're sitting in France, is the idea of an Indo-Pacific seen as some sort of an antidote or a counter to China's growing influence in the world? And also, you made the point about how there are challenges even to the Atlantic system from within it. So given the fact that there are these challenges that exist, and European nations, the United States as well, is facing domestic challenges on identity, on nationalism, on economic protectionism and things like that, how sort of viable is the Atlantic order, in its how much longer can it continue?
So the Indo-Pacific concept, which has integrated the French vocabulary for the past 2 years, 2016, 18, depending on the ministry, is not seen as an anti-China, construct. But what it means, and the fact that it's been used by different kind of regional actors, including the US, the ASEAN, over the past years, is that there's a new strategic engagement with that region to tackle what has been seen as increasing tensions, territorial tensions, an increasing Chinese presence in the region through the Belt and Road initiative. So there is that worry about China, but it's not seen as an anti-China construct. And actually, in that context, I think the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific and Prime Minister Modi's speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue about India's position show that there's an attempt among the different regional players to really stress that the Indo-Pacific construct needs to be inclusive and non-antagonistic. And that's probably the way to go if precisely you want to create a new framework where the different actors can cooperate together.
So, Vikramji, one of the issues that keeps coming up when we talk about the new global order today is this notion of competing nationalisms.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether, technology has increased our dependence and reliance on these borders and the idea of maintaining them, or are we really in a digital borderless universe that tech companies certainly like to talk about? But on the issue of competing nationalisms, because there are these different pulls and pressures, do you think that any talk of global shared values today in the climate we're in is in a sense irrelevant?
I mean, I think that's a very good and it's a difficult question. Before I go to that, I wanted to touch on one thing on the Indo-Pacific framing. India, there would not be an Indo-Pacific if India hadn't embraced the concept. It's sort of Japan, Australia, the United States, and India are really the drivers of this concept. And it's India again, and it sort of echoes what Raphaëlle was saying about India's role in shaping global institutions going back a long, long time. It is shaping this to be open and inclusive. There's no Indo-Pacific without China. That's sort of would be an oxymoron.
Right.
So whether it's Asia Pacific, whether you think Asia is from the Bosphorus to California, it's still China is central and if not dominant in some way. So
right.
So I think that's an important factor. Now, all of the multilateral, multinational, global cooperative frameworks we have are being challenged by a global surge in nationalism, in increases in protectionism,
Yeah.
in a much more widespread set of zero-sum calculations. You know, and really embodied United States right now is very much in a we win,
And just
you lose, whether it's with its allies or
Right,
with
but
adversaries.
just to quickly, I mean, interject and carry on. The idea of this zero sum, you know, you're either with us against or against us. It's either this or it's that. The absence of nuance in a conversation, is it making it harder to cooperate?
Yes, I think it makes it much harder to cooperate, because if you look at areas, in some cases, I see this, for example, the United States-China trade war. You know, the United States probably could have had a lot of its allies actually on side for coordinated action to pressure China, but it was engaging in similar trade wars with all of its allies at the same time. And so that idea of sort of ad hoc orders where close countries or regional blocs or you know, the Atlantic Alliance act in concert, that is really being challenged by rising nationalisms. And the nationalism in states like China, more authoritarian single-party systems, is similarly able to take advantage of the divisions caused by rising nationalisms among these democratic states.
Not just on whether China is taking advantage of this, but the idea, in fact, yesterday, I don't know if you heard India's Foreign Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, speak at the Raisina Dialogue, and in response to a question on how domestic politics, as sort of robust as debate may be, you know, policy decisions that are seen as against certain populations domestically are impacting India's image abroad. It's occupying Indian diplomats, you know, in order to do an image correction exercise much more than regular diplomacy. Nonetheless, he said that these issues are global. They're what we're seeing in India are national variants of global issues. And before the Atlantic system or any other country in the world can actually point a finger at India and tell us what we should or should not be doing, what about what they are doing themselves? So not just the zero-sum game, but also the issue of saying you're actually no better in no better a position to tell us what we may need to do. Where is that leading global conversation? This, you know, if the West is sort of telling India, you know, fix your domestic conversation, why is the West not saying the same thing about China, for example, in such a robust way as well, if it's about shared values and shared liberal values?
I think, I mean, you're right. There's an issue with nationalism and then building an international order. Which,
yeah.
And so I think there needs to be a global awareness of the importance today of multilateralism, how you build again a strong multilateral system based on common values, shared values, and as you say, every different actors in a sense have issues with these values
within
today.
themselves, yes.
Yeah, and with different facets of multilateralism. But that's a question that we cannot evade if we want to tackle the global issues that we have, because today the most pressing issues are global issues. So you're absolutely right about that.
So, last question to you. I mean, you can answer it as well as let me ask you a quick follow-up question, Vikramjit. You know, on this issue of the need for reviving multilateral frameworks, really, you come from the United States. We know what the US president today says about the United Nations, for example, or global partnerships, and how, you know, he's willing to walk out of any of them. And this is from the leader of the liberal order, the leader of the Atlantic system. So, you know,
it's not sustainable. I mean, the challenges we face are going to require multilateral solutions. The best solutions are going to come when like-minded nations come together to press for solutions that they can agree on. And you saw in the Paris Climate Accords, for example, the Atlantic Order and a lot of the global South coming together because they had common interests and really pushing countries, including China and India, in a constructive direction. Without that, we see the backsliding that's happening. And these domestic issues are, if they're not dealt with in some cooperative way. My vision would be that countries with shared values start having shared critiques of one another, actually, and helping one another do as well as they can. I think that would be a better way than just sort of accusations against each other in the media. But it's a real challenge to the order going forward.
Right, and I think no easy answers either.
No easy answers.
But thank you both very much for being part of this conversation. We're completely out of time, but I think, left to us, we can talk about this for days,
Definitely.
The challenges to the international order, the challenges from economic protectionism, the challenges of rising nationalism and identity politics, and how those are actually shaking the very foundations of multilateralism. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining.
Thanks, Maya.
Thank you.